onto the statute book, beginning the work of change. And I think this document is significant. This coalition government has produced, in a pretty short period of time, an extensive and detailed reform agenda. And there's a reason why this has been possible. Yes, it's because the urgency of the hour required compromise and negotiation. Yes, it's because we had politicians on both sides who were willing to put aside party interests in favour of the national interest, but also because the more that we talked, the more we listened, the more we realised that our visions for this country and the values that inspired them are strengthened and enhanced by the act of the two parties coming together. Of course, we cannot stand here and say this process has been an effortless fusion of our two manifestos. There has been negotiation. Some policies have been lost on both sides. Some have been changed. And yes, we've had to find ways to deal with the issues where we profoundly disagree. And I want to be completely frank about that. I don't want to disappoint people later. I want to be clear now. To the millions of people who voted Conservative at the last general election, the good news is that we will deliver our promises on the jobs tax, on a referendum lock on Europe, on a cap on immigration, on radical school reform, on welfare reform, and yes, much more besides. But the bad news is that some policies have been changed. But to me, aside from the good news or the bad news, the real news is that Britain has something that all Conservatives profoundly believe in, which is strong and stable government in the national interest to do the right thing. For me, the most important value underpinning this programme is the value of responsibility. On the steps of Downing Street, I said I wanted to help build a more responsible society, a big society, one where we don't just ask, what are my entitlements, but what are my responsibilities? One where we don't just ask, what am I owed, but what more can I give? A guide for that society is that those who can should, and those who can't, we always help. You can see how the value of responsibility is woven through this policy programme. It's there in our plans to reform welfare. We'll say to those who can work, you should work, and if you don't and refuse a good job offer, your benefits will be cut. It's there in our plans to strengthen families. So as we make savings from our welfare reforms, we will start to phase out the couple penalty and the tax credit system that pays couples to live apart, which for years has sent out a completely crazy signal about what is responsible and what is not. It's there in our plans to cut crime. We're going to score a thick line between right and wrong through every community with our plans for real reform of our criminal justice system. And the value of responsibility is there in our plans to limit immigration, because controlling our borders is the right thing to do by the people of this country. Creating a responsible society has always been my mission in politics, and that has not changed. For the most part, there's not been disagreement or compromise. We found many areas where there was complete agreement in both mission and method. One of those areas is rebalancing the powers held by the state and the individual. Both our parties think the state has got too big for its boots. So together we'll dismantle the architecture of state interference with our new Freedom Bill. The Home Secretary has spoken about how we'll do that, with particular emphasis on protecting our civil liberties. But this programme shows how we intend to go much further than that, cutting the number of quangos, opening up the whole process of government, what it does, how it spends your money, pushing power out to families, communities and individuals. This new government will tear down the big, bossy, bureaucratic, unaccountable state and replace it with one that answers to you. There are other areas where instead of just adopting those policies which previously overlapped, we've tried to combine our party's best ideas and attitudes to create something that is greater than the sum of our two manifestos. Take our plans for the NHS. We've taken conservative thinking on markets, on choice, on competition, and brought it together with the Liberal Democrat belief in advancing democracy to a much more local level, to create a more radical reform agenda than the one that either of us had before. So we're going to have GPs with authority over commissioning, patients with much more control, and elections for your local primary care trust. The Liberal Democrat Conservative plan for the NHS is therefore more bold, more radical, more decentralising than either of us had planned for. And I want that to be a big part of the story of our coalition. So let me end by saying this. I am a Conservative Prime Minister leading a coalition. Nick is a Liberal Democrat Deputy Prime Minister helping to drive this coalition forward. We will always be clear about that. From its inception, this coalition has been about cooperation and engagement. It's been animated by a spirit of openness. It's been driven forward by shared values and a shared purpose. And now we want to open this process out to the whole of our country. We want you to get involved, reclaim your democracy, have your say. This document and the programme for government contained within it will now enter a period of public scrutiny and consultation and comment. You'll be able to guide its mission, its policies, its priorities. Next week in the Queen's speech, we'll be announcing plans for a new public reading stage of all bills so that you can help shape and form them. And as Nick explained in his speech yesterday, we also want people to play a full part in developing our Freedom Bill, suggesting regulations that can go, laws that should be discarded, incursions of state power that should be rolled back. This coalition, I believe, has the potential to be a great reforming government, united behind the three principles of freedom, of fairness and responsibility, but above all, united in the purpose of bringing strong, stable, decisive government to our country. Thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for listening. Happy to take questions. Let's have Nick Robinson.
Prime Minister, thank you. Nick Robinson from BBC News. Is there not a problem emerging with this coalition already, which is you, the Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister look happier with each other than you are with either of your own political parties, and they're beginning to notice? And if I may add one thing, isn't there another problem, which is governments are not defined by documents like this, they're defined by events. Take the crisis in the Eurozone. He would want Europe to integrate. You would want it to block it at all costs. How on earth are you going to make your mind up?
Well, let's take the second question first. I mean, clearly, you're right that governments are defined by events and how you respond to them. And for that, you need two things. You do need to have a programme that sets out what you want to achieve and the way you want to achieve it, because that helps you, and that's one of the things that's so important about this document, is to have a guide for what you want to do, because that helps you in how you respond. The second thing is you do need good relations at the heart of government, and also good processes to make those relations work. And while Nick and I agree about a new politics, there is one part of something rather old politics I want to bring back, which is actually having good, effective government that works through proper processes, actually sitting around a table rather than hunched on a sofa. And I think that bringing back some of those processes and the good relations you can already see building up between ministers will help deliver the sort of quietly effective government that I aspire to lead. Now, in terms of our parties, I don't accept what you say. I sense in the Conservative Party there is a real enthusiasm for the fact that we have the strong, stable government that we want to deliver. Of course, people will be disappointed that some policies have had to be discarded as a coalition comes together. But what I find is, just as I feel, as a very pragmatic politician, that the more we work together, actually the more I can see it's not just about day-to-day events, it's about a shared vision. So actually other colleagues are beginning to see that too. And I think also, in a very practical way, what would a government be able to achieve with in a minority, or even in a small majority, compared with what we can achieve with a decent majority? People are beginning to see that as well. Of course, it's going to take a different way of managing both our parties, I suspect, in terms of taking them with us. And that's already evidenced by the number of meetings that I've held. Of course, it will take that, but it is well worth it. And I think the more people see the coalition working, the more they will see it is the right thing to do. Do you want to add to that? Glenn.
Thank you very much. Glenn Glaser from Sky News. We noticed that the 31 chapter headings in here are in alphabetical order, but it just so happens that banking is the first one. And there is an immediate problem with banking, and I think there's a general consensus that banks are not lending enough to small businesses. And yet you've decided to set up a commission on the issue of separating out the investment and retail branches, arms of banks, which could take up to a year to report. And there seems to be a constant theme throughout the document, for example, on long-term social care and disability, another commission. Yeah. An awful lot of commissions in here. I wonder why that is. And also, I wonder if I could pick up on the point about taking your own party with you. You'll know that there is a fair amount of restlessness on the Conservative backbenchers on issues like capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and so on. How concerned are you about that restlessness?
I'll ask George to answer first, and maybe Vince wants to say something on banks. But let me just, I mean, it is a separate issue. Getting banks lending is about net lending agreements and about actually getting the money out of the banks into business. That is separate from the important question of what you actually do about the structure of banks, whereas I think actually there's much more agreement than many people would have thought. In terms of the parties, I think I've answered that point. I mean, clearly, we're all going to have to get used to a new world. It's a world of coalition where you can see in this document how many things have been delivered from each of our manifestos. But yes, of course, some things have to change. And that is a state of mind we have to get into, and the whole party has to get into. And I think it's well down the road of doing that, as it starts to see the advantages of a 5-year parliament where we can tackle the huge problems that we know we have. And this government is going to have